If a disease killed 1 in 3 people around you, your neighbors, your family, your priest, what would you do to survive? Not a hypothetical, not a thought experiment. This happened. Between 1347 and 1351, a disease moved across the known world with a speed and lethality that no human population had ever experienced. It killed indiscriminately the young and the old, the rich and the poor, the devout and the faithless. It killed doctors who tried to treat it and priests who tried to pray it away. It killed entire villages, entire cities, entire regions that would not recover their pre-plague populations for 150 years. And yet, some people survived, not many. In the worst affected areas, survival was the exception, but survival happened. People who breathed the same air, ate the same food, lived in the same houses as those who died, and did not die themselves. Tonight, we are going to try to understand why. Find a comfortable position. Let the weight of the day begin to lift. Close your eyes, or let them rest on a soft, quiet ceiling. Let your breathing slow, in through the nose, out through the mouth, because what you are about to hear is not just a story of death. It is a story of survival, of the stubborn, irrational, magnificent human insistence on continuing to exist, even when existence seems to have been withdrawn as an option. The Black Death killed between 75 and 200 million people. The range is that wide because we are still arguing about it, 7 centuries later. It killed so many people, so fast, that the record-keeping broke down. There were not enough people left to count the dead. There were not enough people left to bury them properly. In some places, there were not enough people left to ring the church bells, but some people lived. Let's find out how. The story begins, as so many of history's worst stories begin, at a port. In October of 1347, 12 Genoese trading ships arrived at the port of Messina, in Sicily. They had come from the Black Sea, from the trading ports of Caffa and Tanna, where Genoese merchants had maintained commercial outposts for generations. The route was well established. The ships were expected. The merchants at the docks would have been waiting for them, calculating the profits from whatever cargo they carried, grain, perhaps, or silk, or spices from the eastern trade routes. When the port authorities came to meet them, they found something that stopped them on the dock. Most of the sailors were dead. The ones who were still alive were covered in strange black swellings, hard, painful lumps the size of eggs or apples, erupting from the armpits and the groin and the neck. Blood and pus seeped from these swellings. The sailor's skin was covered in dark blotches that spread as you watched, as if something beneath the skin was being extinguished. They were feverish, delirious, in obvious agony. Some were unconscious. Some were calling out in languages the port authorities did not recognize, the last words of men who had long since lost the thread of where they were and what was happening to them. The port authorities ordered the ships out of the harbor immediately. It was already too late. Within days, people in Messina were developing the same swellings. Within weeks, the disease had spread to the mainland of Italy, to Catania, to Palermo, up the boot toward the great commercial cities of the north. Within months, it was in France, traveling along the trade routes that connected the Mediterranean ports to Paris and beyond. It was in Spain, It was moving into the German states along the Rhine. By the end of 1348, it had crossed the Channel to England. By 1349, it was in Scandinavia, carried north by trading ships that brought grain from England and took back timber and fish and furs. By 1351, it had reached the Polish-Lithuanian territories and the edges of Russia. It moved, as one contemporary chronicler wrote, like a fire through dry grass. Everything it touched, it consumed. The disease we now call the Black Death, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, transmitted primarily by fleas living on rats, was not entirely new in 1347. There had been plague before. The plague of Justinian in the 6th century had devastated the Byzantine Empire and the Mediterranean world, killing perhaps 25 million people over 2 centuries of recurring outbreaks. Isolated cases had occurred in the intervening years in corners of Central Asia and the Middle East that barely registered in European records. But nothing in any living memory, nothing in any historical record that medieval Europeans had access to, had prepared the world of the 14th century for what arrived in that harbor in Sicily. The speed was terrifying. Plague, in its most common form, the bubonic form, named for the buboes, the swellings in the lymph nodes, killed between 30 and 75% of those it infected within 2 to 7 days of the appearance of symptoms. A person could be apparently healthy on Monday morning, develop a swelling by Monday afternoon, and be dead by Wednesday. In some accounts, people went to bed feeling entirely well and did not wake up. But bubonic plague was not the only form the disease took. There was pneumonic plague, a form in which Yersinia pestis infected the lungs rather than the lymph nodes. Pneumonic plague was transmitted not by fleas, but directly from person to person through the respiratory droplets that a sick person exhaled with every cough, every breath. It was almost invariably fatal, and it was fast, death typically within 1 to 3 days of the first symptoms. And there was septicemic plague, a form in which the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly, triggering a cascade of organ failure and internal bleeding so rapid that the patient sometimes died before the characteristic buboes even had time to form. A person with septicemic plague could appear healthy in the morning and be dead by nightfall, and with no visible symptoms other than the dark discoloration of the skin as blood pooled beneath it. It was the septicemic form, historians believe, that gave the epidemic its common name, the Black Death, the blackening of the skin, the visible, undeniable evidence of what was happening inside. Medieval medicine had no answer for any of it. Medieval medicine, in 1347, was based on a framework inherited from ancient Greek physicians, primarily Galen and Hippocrates, that understood disease as an imbalance of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. A healthy body was one in which these 4 substances existed in proper proportion. Disease was an imbalance, too much of one, too little of another. Treatment consisted of restoring balance through bloodletting, purging, dietary adjustment, and the application of various herbal preparations whose theoretical effects on the humors had been catalogued over centuries of medical tradition. None of this had any effect whatsoever on Yersinia pestis. The physicians of the 14th century were not stupid. They were, within their framework, rigorous and thoughtful practitioners. They observed carefully. They recorded what they saw. They tried to identify patterns. When the pattern, swelling, fever, blackening, a death, refused to respond to any of their interventions, they did not simply give up. They tried other things. They experimented. They debated. But the framework was wrong. The disease was not caused by an imbalance of humors. It was caused by a bacterium, an entity whose existence the 14th century had no concept of, no word for, no way of imagining. And in the face of a disease that killed faster than almost any intervention could be mounted, the wrongness of the framework was catastrophic. The best physicians in Europe stood at the bedsides of dying patients and watched them die, not because they were negligent or uncaring, but because they were working with tools that were simply inadequate to the task. To understand how people survived the Black Death, you need to understand the world it arrived in. The 14th century in Europe was not, by modern standards, a comfortable place to live. Average life expectancy at birth was somewhere between 35 and 45 years, though this figure is misleading because it is dragged down by the extraordinary mortality of infants and young children. In a medieval community, perhaps 1 child in 3 would die before their 5th birthday. Those who survived childhood could expect to live significantly longer, perhaps into their 50s or 60s, if they avoided serious illness, violent conflict, and the accumulated physical damage of a life of heavy labor. But life was genuinely hard. For the vast majority of the population, the peasants, the laborers, the artisans who made up perhaps 90% of medieval society, existence was physical, demanding, and close to the margin. You worked with your body from childhood until you could no longer work. You ate what your land produced and what you could afford to buy. In good years, this was sufficient. In bad years, and the early 14th century had produced a great many bad years, it was not. The social structure was rigid in ways that are difficult for modern people to fully appreciate. Your place in that structure was determined at birth and changed very little over the course of a lifetime. You were born into the peasantry, or the nobility, or the clergy, and that was, with rare exceptions, what you remained. The idea that a person of low birth might, through talent or effort or luck, and transform themselves into something their parents were not, this idea existed in the 14th century, but it was exceptional rather than expected. The church was not merely an institution in this world, it was the framework through which the entire world was understood. The church explained why the world existed and what it was for. It explained human suffering as punishment, as test, as the inevitable consequence of original sin. It explained death as transition, as journey toward judgment, as the beginning of either eternal reward or eternal punishment. It provided the rituals that marked the passage of time and the transitions of life. Baptism at birth, marriage in adulthood, last rites at death. And this framework, this comprehensive, all-encompassing explanation for why everything was the way it was about to encounter something it could not explain. Because the Black Death, when it arrived, it did not behave like a punishment from God, or rather, it did not behave like the kind of punishment from God that medieval theology had prepared people to expect. Divine punishment in the medieval imagination was discriminating. It fell on sinners. It spared the righteous. It was, at some level, comprehensible, a response to human behavior proportionate to human wickedness. The plague was not discriminating. It killed monks who had devoted their entire lives to prayer and fasting and the service of God, men and women who had, by any medieval standard, lived as righteously as human beings could live. It killed children who had barely had time to sin at all. It killed bishops and beggars, scholars and illiterates, the abstemious and the dissolute, the kind and the cruel, in roughly equal proportions. What had the children done? What had the monks done? If this was punishment, who was it punishing? And for what? These questions did not have comfortable answers, and the discomfort they created, the gap between theological expectation and observed reality, was one of the most important intellectual consequences of the Black Death. Let's spend some time with the explanations that medieval people offered for what was happening, because these explanations are not simply wrong. They are windows into how a civilization tries to process an incomprehensible catastrophe, and in processing it, sometimes arrives by the wrong path at conclusions that are partially right. In October of 1348, about a year into the epidemic in Western Europe, the medical faculty of the University of Paris issued an official report on the causes of the plague. This document is one of the most remarkable texts of the medieval period. It was written by the most learned physicians in the most prestigious medical institution in Europe. It was the 14th century's closest equivalent to a government scientific advisory report, and it was read, taken seriously, and acted upon by rulers and administrators across the continent. The Paris faculty's report began, as most official medieval documents began, with theology. God, operating through natural means, had caused a celestial event, a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius on March 20th, 1345, that had corrupted the surrounding air. This corrupted air, breathed in by susceptible individuals, had entered the body and disrupted the balance of the humors, producing the characteristic symptoms of the plague. The report then offered specific medical advice. Avoid the south wind, which carried the corrupted air most directly. Avoid bathing, which opened the pores and allowed the bad air to enter the body more readily. Avoid fruits, vegetables, and other foods believed to be conducive to putrefaction. Eat moderately, sleep moderately, and maintain a calm emotional state, since excessive passion was believed to make the body more susceptible. Burn aromatic woods, juniper, laurel, rosemary, to purify the air in enclosed spaces. Some of this advice was wrong. Avoiding bathing in particular was spectacularly wrong from an epidemiological perspective. Good hygiene reduces flea and lice populations, which reduces plague transmission. The advice to avoid bathing may have contributed to increased mortality in communities that followed it, but some of the advice was partially right. Avoiding crowds, leaving the city for cleaner rural air, burning aromatic substances that might repel fleas. These interventions, prescribed for the wrong reasons, had some effect on the actual transmission pathways. This is one of the recurring patterns in the history of the Black Death: people doing the right thing for the wrong reasons, and people doing the wrong thing for what seemed within their framework, like perfectly good reasons. The astrological and medical explanations were the respectable explanations, the ones offered by universities and physicians and official bodies, but alongside them ran darker explanations, more urgent and more dangerous. In 1348 and 1349, a wave of violence against Jewish communities swept across Europe from Spain to Poland. The charge was well poisoning, the claim that Jews had deliberately introduced the plague into Christian communities by poisoning their water sources. This charge was false. It was demonstrably, observably false. Jewish communities were dying of plague at the same rates as Christian communities, sometimes higher rates. The Jews of Europe were not poisoning wells. They were dying in them. But the charge was repeated in city after city, believed by populations desperate for an explanation that made the plague comprehensible, not a random catastrophe, but a deliberate attack with agents who could be identified and destroyed. Pope Clement VI issued 2 papal bulls explicitly stating that Jews were dying of plague at the same rates as Christians, and that the accusations were false. The bulls had essentially no effect. The massacres continued. In the city of Strasbourg alone, approximately 2,000 Jewish men, women, and children were burned alive in February of 1349. In Mainz, the entire Jewish community, approximately 6,000 people, was killed. In Basel, in Freiburg, in Augsburg, in hundreds of smaller communities across the German territories and beyond, Jewish populations were attacked and destroyed. The Black Death did not cause anti-Semitism in medieval Europe. Anti-Semitism had deep roots in European Christian culture that predated the plague by centuries. But the plague intensified it, weaponized it, gave it a specific and lethal focus. The Jews of 14th century Europe became the targets of the fear and rage and helplessness that the plague generated, and they died for it in numbers that would not be equaled until the 20th century. And then there were the flagellants. The flagellant movement was one of the most extraordinary mass phenomena in the history of medieval Europe. It began in Central Europe in 1348 and spread rapidly westward, reaching its peak in the winter of 1348 and 1349. Groups of men, sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds, occasionally thousands, organized themselves into disciplined processions and traveled from town to town across Germany, France, the Low Countries, and into England. Their practice was public, theatrical, and deeply disturbing to observers. Twice a day, in public squares and churchyards, the flagellants would strip to the waist, fall to the ground in a configuration symbolizing the posture of Christ in the tomb, and then rise and beat themselves with leather straps studded with sharp metal spikes. They beat their backs, their chests, their shoulders until the blood ran. They sang hymns. They wept. They called on God for mercy. The crowds that gathered to watch them were enormous. People were moved to tears, to ecstasy, to spontaneous acts of religious devotion. Men stripped off their outer garments and joined the processions on the spot. Women wept at the roadside. The flagellants were widely believed to be doing something genuinely necessary, taking on the suffering that the plague represented, demonstrating to God that his people were serious about repentance. They were also, from an epidemiological perspective, extraordinarily effective disease vectors. Large groups of people traveling together through multiple communities, sleeping in close quarters, gathering crowds wherever they went, their open wounds potentially carrying the very disease they were attempting to atone for. The flagellants almost certainly spread plague to communities that might otherwise have been spared. The Pope condemned the movement in October 1349, partly for theological reasons. The flagellant leaders were making claims about the power of self-flagellation to substitute for priestly absolution, which was a direct challenge to clerical authority, and partly because the processions were becoming increasingly disorderly and violent. By then, the movement had already burned through much of Western Europe. Now, let's talk about what actually kept people alive. Because people did survive, and while some of that survival was purely random, a matter of not being in the wrong place at the wrong time, of not being bitten by the particular flea carrying the particular strain of Yersinia pestis that happened to be circulating in your community at that moment. Some of it was not random at all. The first survival mechanism was flight. Giovanni Boccaccio was a Florentine writer who lived through the plague in that city and survived it. His great work, the Decameron, is structured around a conceit that reflects, with remarkable accuracy, one of the most effective strategies for surviving the Black Death. A group of 10 young Florentines, 7 women and 3 men, retreat to a country villa outside the city when the plague arrives and spend 10 days telling each other stories. The Decameron's prologue describes Florence during the plague with a specificity and a visceral detail that makes it one of the most important primary sources we have. Boccaccio describes the swellings, the smell, the carts piled with bodies rolling through the streets. He describes the collapse of normal social bonds, parents abandoning children, husbands abandoning wives, neighbors crossing the street to avoid each other. And he describes the various strategies that Florentines adopted in response. Some, he writes, formed small groups and retreated into their houses, avoiding all contact with the outside world, eating moderately, drinking little wine, listening to music, and refusing admission to any news of the dead or dying. Others took the opposite approach, reasoning that the plague was going to kill them regardless. They spent the days and nights eating and drinking as much as they could, moving from tavern to tavern, singing and laughing and refusing to think about what was happening around them. And then there were those who did what the Decameron's characters do, who left, who went to the countryside, to the clean air and the open spaces and the relative freedom from the concentration of disease that made cities so deadly. This strategy worked, not perfectly. The plague reached the countryside as well, carried by travelers and merchants, and the movements of rats and fleas that no human decision could entirely control. But the mortality rates in rural areas were consistently lower than in urban ones. The density of population that made cities economically vibrant also made them biologically dangerous. Fewer people, fewer fleas, fewer transmissions. The second survival mechanism was early quarantine. The city of Venice, in 1348, did something that had never been done systematically before in European history. It established a committee of 3 city officials with specific responsibility for managing the plague's impact on the city. This committee ordered that ships arriving from plague-affected ports be required to anchor offshore, away from the docks, away from the population, for a specified period before their passengers and cargo could enter the city. The initial period was 30 days, It was later extended to 40 days, quarantina in Italian, from quaranta, 40. This is where the word quarantine comes from. The 40-day period was chosen, in part, for theological reasons. 40 days echoes throughout the Bible, from the flood to Lent to Christ's time in the desert. But it was also, as it turned out, a reasonable approximation of the time needed for a plague infection to run its full course. If someone on a ship was infected when the ship anchored, they would almost certainly have either died or recovered within 40 days. A ship that completed its quarantine without incident was almost certainly safe. Venice also established one of the first dedicated plague hospitals, spaces where the sick could be isolated from the healthy, where bodies could be disposed of safely, where the concentrated population of the infected could be kept away from the uninfected population of the city. These measures were imperfect. They were inconsistently enforced. They were resented by merchants whose profits depended on the free movement of goods and people. They were sometimes too late. The plague had often already entered the city by the time the measures were implemented, but they worked, not completely, not enough to prevent catastrophic mortality in Venice, but enough to reduce it, enough to demonstrate for the first time in recorded history that deliberate human intervention in the transmission of infectious disease was possible. This is one of the great, under-acknowledged contributions of the Black Death to human civilization. It taught us, at enormous cost, the basic principles of public health. The third survival mechanism was nursing care. This seems almost too simple to state, but it is worth stating clearly because its implications are profound. A person with bubonic plague who received adequate nursing care, fluids to combat dehydration, warmth to manage the fever, clean dressings on the buboes if they burst, food if the patient could eat, had a significantly higher chance of surviving than a person who was left alone. The mortality rate for untreated bubonic plague is approximately 30 to 60%. With good supportive care, not with antibiotics, which would not exist for another 6 centuries, but with fluids and warmth and human attention, that rate decreases. The problem was proximity. Providing nursing care requires physical closeness to the sick, and physical closeness to someone with plague, breathing the same air, touching the same surfaces, in close enough contact to transmit the pneumonic form directly, was itself dangerous. Many of the people who died during the Black Death were not victims of the plague's first wave, but of its second and third. The family members who stayed, the servants who tended to their employers, the members of religious orders whose vocation explicitly required them to care for the sick and dying. The Franciscan and Dominican friars in particular suffered catastrophic losses during the plague years. Their rule required them to go where suffering was, to minister to the sick, to comfort the dying, to be present at the deathbeds that everyone else was fleeing. They went, they ministered, they died in enormous numbers, and some of them survived. Survivors of bubonic plague who had developed partial immunity to subsequent infection. People who, through some combination of genetics and exposure and the particular biology of their immune systems, had come through the plague and were still standing. This brings us to one of the most significant discoveries of modern plague research. Some people are genetically resistant to plague, not immune. Resistance is different from immunity, and no one appears to be fully immune to Yersinia pestis. but resistant. Their bodies, when exposed to the bacterium, mount a faster and more effective immune response. They may develop the disease in a milder form. They may recover from doses of infection that kill others. The specific genetic variant most commonly associated with plague resistance involves a mutation in a gene called CCR5. The CCR5 delta 32 mutation, a deletion of a specific sequence of 32 base pairs from the CCR5 gene on chromosome 3, appears to reduce susceptibility to certain pathogens, including plague. A person who carries one copy of this mutation, inheriting it from one parent but not the other, has some degree of resistance. A person who carries two copies, inheriting it from both parents, has significantly greater resistance. The CCR5 delta 32 mutation is found in approximately 10 to 15% of people of European ancestry today. It is found at much lower rates, sometimes essentially zero, in populations from Africa, East Asia, or the Americas. This geographic distribution correlates with remarkable consistency with the regions most severely affected by plague in the 14th century. This has led researchers to a striking conclusion. The Black Death, by killing a large and not entirely random fraction of the European population, created intense selective pressure for the CCR5 delta 32 mutation. The people who carried this mutation were more likely to survive, more likely to have children, more likely to pass the mutation to the next generation. And as successive waves of plague swept through Europe over the following 3 centuries, this selective pressure was reinforced again and again. The Black Death, in other words, changed the genetic composition of European populations, changed it in a measurable, detectable way that persists in the genomes of living people today. But the story does not end there. The CCR5 delta 32 mutation, the one that appears to have helped people survive the Black Death, also happens to confer significant resistance to a completely different pathogen, HIV, the human immunodeficiency virus that causes AIDS. HIV enters human immune cells through a protein called CCR5, which sits on the surface of certain white blood cells. The CCR5 delta 32 mutation alters the structure of this protein in a way that prevents HIV from using it as an entry point. People who carry 2 copies of the mutation are almost entirely resistant to HIV infection through normal transmission routes. People who carry 1 copy have some degree of partial resistance and, if infected, tend to progress to AIDS more slowly than people with no copies. This connection was noticed in the late 1990s when researchers studying the genetics of HIV resistance found that the CCR5 delta 32 mutation was present at much higher rates in people who had been repeatedly exposed to HIV without becoming infected. They traced the mutation's history, identified its unusual geographic distribution, and concluded that it had been selected for in European populations by some historical epidemic, most likely the Black Death. The survivors of the plague left a mark in the DNA of their descendants, a mark that, 7 centuries later, is protecting some of those descendants from a disease that the plague survivors could not possibly have imagined. We carry the Black Death in our genes. The catastrophe of the 14th century is written in the bodies of the people alive today. The Black Death did not just kill people, it dismantled the structures through which people organized their lives. Consider what it means to lose between a third and a half of your population in 4 years, not slowly, through the kind of gradual decline that allows adaptation and adjustment, but rapidly, catastrophically, in waves that killed faster than any response could be organized. The farmer next door is dead. The miller who ground his grain is dead. The blacksmith who shod his horses is dead. The priest who administered his sacraments is dead. The midwife who delivered his children is dead. The woman 3 houses down who knew how to treat fever in children is dead. The man who knew how to repair the mill wheel, the knowledge accumulated over 20 years of practical experience, is dead, and that knowledge is gone with him. This is what historians mean when they talk about the destruction of human capital, not just the loss of lives, but the loss of knowledge, skill, and institutional memory embedded in those lives. Knowledge that had taken generations to accumulate was erased in seasons. Trades lost their practitioners, crafts lost their masters, villages lost the people who knew how things worked and how to fix them when they broke. The economic consequences of this loss were profound, and they ran in directions that the surviving nobility and clergy found extremely uncomfortable. With so many workers dead, labor became genuinely scarce. In a market economy, and the medieval economy, for all its differences from modern capitalism, was in significant ways a market economy. Scarcity creates leverage. The workers who survived the plague found themselves, for the first time in the memory of anyone alive, in a position to make demands. They demanded higher wages. They demanded better conditions. They demanded the right to move from one employer to another in search of better pay. Landlords who had previously been able to extract maximum labor at minimum cost found themselves competing for the workers they needed to bring in the harvest. The response of the established order was swift and revealing. In England, in the Statute of Labourers of 1351, passed by a parliament dominated by the same landowners who were now competing for workers, attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and to make it illegal for laborers to demand higher pay or to leave their current employers. In France, similar legislation was enacted. In other parts of Europe, legal and economic mechanisms were deployed to try to restore the pre-plague labor market. They largely failed. The economic reality was too powerful for legislation to overcome. When you have twice as much land to farm and half as many workers to farm it, the workers have leverage regardless of what the law says. The landlords who refused to offer better wages found their fields unfarmed. The landlords who offered better wages got workers. Over the following decades and into the 15th century, the real wages of English agricultural laborers rose substantially. The conditions of tenancy improved. A serfdom, the legal binding of peasants to specific land and specific lords, which had been the economic foundation of the medieval order, began to erode, not everywhere, not immediately, not without resistance, but the direction of movement was clear. The Black Death killed perhaps a third of England's population. The people who survived lived, on average, materially better than the people who died. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths in all of medieval history, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. Catastrophic mortality, by creating labor scarcity, can improve the living standards of survivors. This does not justify the deaths. Nothing justifies the deaths. The deaths were a catastrophe, the greatest catastrophe in European history, and arguably in human history to that point, but the economic consequences of that catastrophe are part of its historical legacy, and they matter for understanding what the Black Death actually did to the civilization it struck. The feudal order of medieval Europe, the rigid hierarchy of nobility, clergy, and peasantry, each locked into their social position by law and tradition and economic necessity, had already been under strain before 1347. The famines of the early 14th century, the economic disruptions caused by decades of warfare, and the gradual development of a money economy that complicated the traditional relationships of lord and serf, these had all been working slowly to loosen the medieval order. The Black Death accelerated that loosening to a point where it became irreversible. The world that emerged from the plague could not go back to what it had been before. There were simply not enough people to maintain the old structures. New relationships between landowners and laborers had to be negotiated. New economic arrangements had to be made. The process was painful, contested, and far from linear, but it was in its ultimate direction towards something different. Let's hear from the people who were there. Henry Knighton was an Augustinian canon at Leicester Abbey in England, who wrote a chronicle of events in the late 14th century that is one of the most detailed accounts we have of the plague's impact on an English community. He was not in the major cities. He was in the kind of provincial English town that the plague reached in 1349, moving up from the south coast and through the market towns of the Midlands with the same relentless, indifferent velocity that it had shown everywhere else. Knighton writes of a country that has simply been emptied. He describes villages where every inhabitant has died, not some, not most, but every one, and the houses stand open to the weather, the animals wandering loose in the fields, the crops unharvested. He describes livestock worth almost nothing because there are no buyers, sheep that would have sold for a shilling apiece before the plague selling for a penny, or not selling at all because there is no one with money to buy them and no one with the labor to tend them. He describes, with the flat precision of a man trying to make sense of something that resists sense, a world in which the normal transactions of economic and social life have simply stopped. Markets where no one comes, roads where no one travels, churches standing empty because the congregations and the priests alike are dead, and then, with a kind of careful attention to the specific and the local that makes his chronicle so valuable, he describes what happened afterward. The gradual return of activity, the renegotiation of economic relationships, the arguments between landlords and laborers over wages, the attempts by Parliament to legislate the pre-plague order back into existence, the failure of those attempts. Knighton does not editorialize. He records, and what he records is the story of a society trying to reconstitute itself out of catastrophe, finding that the catastrophe has changed the conditions under which reconstitution is possible. Agnolo di Tura was a citizen of Siena, one of the great Italian cities of the medieval period, a city of merchants and bankers and artists, a city that had been building its magnificent cathedral for nearly a century and would be building it still when the plague arrived. He wrote a chronicle of the plague years in Siena that is, by the standards of the genre, unusually personal. He writes about burying 5 of his own children with his own hands. He writes this not as a complaint or a lament, but as a fact, a thing that happened, that he did, that is part of the record he is keeping. The restraint makes it more devastating than any amount of explicit grief would be. He describes the silence of Siena, a city that had been one of the most economically and culturally vibrant in Europe, a city of 50,000 people, of constant commercial activity, of building projects and festivals, and the ordinary noise of dense urban life reduced to near silence. The markets closed, the streets empty, the bells of the cathedral silenced, and because there were not enough bell ringers left, and because the constant tolling had become psychologically unbearable for the survivors. He writes, "In many places in Siena, great pits were dug and piled deep with the multitude of dead, and they died by the hundreds, both day and night, and all were thrown in those ditches and covered with earth, and as soon as those ditches were filled, more were dug." And then he writes about the aftermath, the city beginning, slowly, to breathe again, new people arriving to fill the positions left empty by the dead, economic activity tentatively resuming, the cathedral construction, which had halted entirely during the worst months, resuming, though on a reduced scale, because the ambition that had imagined a cathedral that would have been the largest in Christendom could not be sustained in a city that had lost half its population. The Siena that emerged from the plague built something smaller, something scaled to what it actually was, rather than what it had once imagined being. Here we enter the territory of the uncertain, the debated, the places where evidence thins and interpretation must do more work. The first speculative question is whether the Black Death was actually bubonic plague. The standard account that the Black Death was caused by Yersinia pestis is strongly supported by ancient DNA evidence. Yersinia pestis DNA has been recovered from multiple excavations of 14th century plague cemeteries across Europe. The specific strains identified match the phylogenetic history of the bacterium in ways that confirm the Black Death as a Yersinia pestis event. But some researchers argue that the characteristics of the Black Death, its speed, its mortality rate, its ability to spread rapidly in cold northern climates where rat flea transmission should be limited, are inconsistent with what we observe in modern bubonic plague outbreaks. Modern plague, when it occurs, spreads at roughly 1 to 2 miles per day and has mortality rates in the range of 30 to 60% without treatment. The Black Death appears to have spread much faster and killed much more efficiently. One hypothesis suggests that the Black Death may have been a co-epidemic, that Yersinia pestis was present and causing plague, but that another pathogen was spreading simultaneously, contributing to the overall mortality. Some researchers have proposed anthrax as a cofactor, particularly in explaining the high livestock mortality that accompanied the human epidemic. Others have proposed a viral hemorrhagic fever with characteristics similar to Ebola. These hypotheses remain minority views. The DNA evidence is compelling, but the anomalous characteristics of the Black Death continue to generate legitimate scientific debate. The second speculative question concerns the relationship between the Black Death and the climate crisis of the 14th century. The Black Death did not arrive in a stable world. It arrived in a world that was already in serious environmental trouble. In the early 14th century, the decades immediately before the plague, Europe experienced a series of catastrophic harvest failures driven by a climate shift. The medieval warm period, which had allowed the expansion of agriculture into previously marginal lands and had supported the population growth of the 12th and 13th centuries, was ending. The transition to cooler, wetter conditions, what climatologists call the onset of the Little Ice Age, produced repeated crop failures across northern Europe in the second decade of the 14th century. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 killed millions of people. In some regions, the mortality was comparable to what the plague would later achieve. Livestock died of cold and disease. Grain rotted in the fields. Communities that had been marginal even in good times simply ceased to exist. A population weakened by a decade of inadequate nutrition is a population whose immune systems are compromised. Malnutrition impairs the body's ability to mount effective responses to infection. The children born during the famine years of the 1310s and 1320s, the young adults of 1347, may have entered the plague epidemic already biologically disadvantaged by their early life nutritional deprivation. This climate-disease connection is now central to how historians understand the Black Death. It was not simply a bacterial infection imported from Central Asia. It was a bacterial infection that struck a population already weakened by years of environmental stress in a world already under severe ecological pressure. The Black Death was not a bolt from the blue. It was the final blow in a sequence of disasters that had been accumulating for a generation. The third speculative question is the largest. What did the Black Death do to European civilization in the long run? We have already touched on the economic consequences, the labor scarcity, the rise of wages, the erosion of serfdom, but the intellectual and cultural consequences were equally profound, and they operated on a longer time scale that makes them harder to trace directly. The medieval church emerged from the Black Death with its authority damaged. Not destroyed, the 14th century was still a profoundly religious world, and many survivors emerged from the experience more devout, not less. But damaged in a specific way, its explanations had failed, its interventions had not worked, its claim to mediate between humanity and God had been tested in the most extreme circumstances imaginable, and the test had not gone well. This does not mean that people stopped believing in God after the Black Death. They did not, but they began, slowly and unevenly, to think differently about the relationship between institutional religion and personal faith, between priestly authority and individual conscience. The questions raised by the plague's indiscriminate killing: why did the righteous die alongside the wicked? What was the relationship between human behavior and divine response? Were questions that the medieval church struggled to answer, and whose answers other thinkers in the following centuries would propose in ways that challenged church authority directly. The humanist movement of the Italian Renaissance, which began developing in the decades after the first plague wave, drew on a revived interest in classical antiquity that had been building before the plague. But the plague accelerated it by weakening the institutional framework that had constrained intellectual inquiry, and by creating, in the generation of survivors and their children, an acute awareness of human mortality that gave humanist questions about the nature of the good life, about what it means to live well in the face of death, an urgency they might not otherwise have had. The Reformation of the 16th century, Luther, Calvin, the fracturing of Western Christian unity had causes that long predated the plague, but the erosion of papal authority that the plague contributed to, the questioning of institutional religion that the plague's failures provoked, the general destabilization of medieval certainties that the plague accelerated, these were part of the soil from which the Reformation grew. The Black Death did not cause the Renaissance, it did not cause the Reformation, but it helped create the conditions in which both were possible. Let's go inside, not as historians or epidemiologists, but as people. It is sometime in 1349. You are in a market town in northern France, a town of perhaps 3,000 people, prosperous by the standards of the time, with a weekly market, a parish church, a mill, a blacksmith, a baker, a tanner, an apothecary, a normal town, a town where, before the plague, the main concerns were the harvest and the weather and the price of grain and the ordinary conflicts and negotiations of community life. The plague arrived 6 weeks ago. You know this because the first death, a merchant who had come from Paris, was 6 weeks ago. Since then, you have lost the tanner, the tanner's wife, their 2 eldest children, the miller, the baker's apprentice, one of the 2 parish priests, the blacksmith, and perhaps 30 or 40 others whose names and faces you knew. You are alive. You have no explanation for this. You attended the same masses as those who died. You drew water from the same well. You breathed the same air, and you are alive, and they are not. It is evening. The town is not silent. Sounds still come from the houses around you, and the ordinary sounds of people still living, but it is quieter than it should be. The tanner's house, which should be producing the particular smells and sounds of the tanner's trade at this hour, is dark. The baker's shop, which should be warm and fragrant with the morning's bread, has been closed for a week. You lie in your house, in the dark, and you listen to your own breathing. This has become a habit. You listen for changes in your breathing, for the slight thickening that might indicate the beginning of the pneumonic form, for any hint of a cough that was not there before. You check the soft places of your body, the armpits, the groin, the neck, for any swelling that might be the beginning of a bubo. Every morning when you wake and find yourself unswollen, breathing easily, free of fever, is a reprieve that you have learned not to trust too completely. Your neighbor's child died 2 days ago. She was 7 years old. You knew her since she was born. You heard her through the wall of your adjoining houses, her laughter, her arguments with her younger brother, the sound of her feet on the wooden floor. And then you heard other sounds, the particular sounds of illness, which you have learned to recognize and to dread, and then silence. You did not go in. You did not go to help. You are not proud of this. You tell yourself that you had your own children to protect, that proximity to the sick was itself a form of recklessness, that there was nothing you could have done that would have helped. These things are true. They do not entirely ease the weight of having stood at your own door and listened to a child die on the other side of the wall. In the morning you will get up. You will make a fire. You will prepare whatever food you have. You will check on the old woman who lives at the end of the street, the one who has survived everything, who has buried 2 children and a husband in the last 6 weeks and is still somehow there. You will see if the market is open. It has been intermittent, some weeks functioning, other weeks abandoned. And if it is, you will buy what food is available. You will do these things not because you have any particular confidence in the future, but because the living have needs that must be met, regardless of whether the future is confident. Your children are hungry. That fact does not wait for the plague to pass. This is what survival looked like from the inside for the people who experienced it. Not heroism, generally. Not even courage in any obvious sense. Mostly just the continuation of the ordinary activities of life, made strange and heavy by everything that had been lost, but continuing nonetheless. The fire made, the food prepared, the neighbor checked on. Life going on because life goes on, because there is no other option, because the people you love still need you to get up and make the fire. The last confirmed death of the first great wave of the Black Death in Western Europe occurred sometime around 1353. By then, the epidemic had run its course through virtually every region of the continent, from the ports of Sicily and southern France, where it had arrived in 1347, to the remotest communities of Scandinavia and the eastern borderlands of Europe. The final toll, as best as modern historians can estimate it, was somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's total population. In some regions, parts of France, parts of Italy, parts of England, the mortality was higher. In a few places, through isolation or luck, or the effectiveness of early containment measures, it was lower. The survivors lived with what they had seen for the rest of their lives. There is no historical evidence that people of the 14th century had access to anything resembling modern grief counseling or psychological support. They had their faith, which had been shaken but not destroyed. They had their communities, which were smaller than before, but still there. They had the work of continuing to exist. The harvest still needed bringing in. The fires still needed building. The children still needed feeding. And they had each other, the complicated, wordless bond of people who have survived the same catastrophe, who know, without having to say it, what the silence in the other person's eyes is about. They rebuilt. In England, the population losses of the Black Death were not fully recovered until the 16th century, nearly 200 years later. In some parts of France, the recovery took almost as long. The world that was rebuilt was not the same world that had existed before. It was a world with fewer people in it, a world where the old certainties about the hierarchy of society, about the authority of the church, about the relationship between human action and divine response, had been destabilized in ways that could not be entirely stabilized again. A world that was already, in the decades after the first plague wave, beginning to look, in certain ways, like the beginnings of what we would eventually call modernity. The survivors built that world, the ones who had watched everyone around them die, the ones who had buried children with their own hands, the ones who had lain awake in the dark, listening for changes in their own breathing, the ones who had made the choice to stay, or the choice to flee, or the choice to continue caring for the sick, and had, through some combination of genetics and behavior and luck, come through. They built hospitals. They built new trade networks. They wrote poetry, some of the most extraordinary poetry in the history of any language, grappling with mortality and beauty, and the stubborn persistence of desire in the face of death. They painted, with a new attention to the human body and its fragility, images that are still among the most moving ever produced. They did what humans do with survival. They made something, The Black Death killed between 75 and 200 million people, but some people lived. And tonight, wherever you are, whatever weight you are carrying, whatever silence is around you, you are the descendant of people who survived the unsurvivable. The CCR5 Delta 32 mutation that may be in your genome right now, the one that helped your ancestors survive the plague, the one that might protect some of your contemporaries from HIV, was selected for in the bodies of people who watched half the world die and kept going anyway. That is in your blood. That is in your bones. That is the biological legacy of people who had every reason to give up and did not. Sleep well. You come from survivors. Good night.